Hello everybody, I hope you're all doing well and the classes are going good. Hopefully you can't hear the two squirrels that are having like a death match right outside of my window right now. They're screeching and they're banging into the gutter, and hopefully that doesn't come across on the audio, but if it does, please just try to ignore it. So what I want to do today is expand on some of the ideas that we talked about in the lecture last week about how our ability to more effectively express ourselves, whether we're trying to tell a story or whether we're trying to make an argument, increases with the increase of new media and with the increase of new technology, and that's been true all throughout history. The main goal hasn't changed, and that main goal is to convey or to communicate an idea from one person to another. It's just that now we have more tools available in order for us to do that more precisely. So when we think about all the way back to ancient times, if somebody wanted to tell a story, what they would do is gather their friends around. Maybe they'd be standing around a campfire or something, or there would be a professional storyteller like a bard who would be in the public square and they'd tell their story orally, right? It'd be a spoken communication and everybody would gather around and it'd be like performance art. That's how stories were told. But when paper and writing came along, that was no longer the only means that the storytellers could go about conveying what they wanted to convey. Then they had two methods. And that isn't to say that the old method wasn't as good or that it became obsolete. It's just to say that there were more options available to them now. And this has happened again and again whenever a new technology emerges. So for the longest time, writing and books were the primary means of communicating a story, although you still had theater, which kind of harkens back to your oral tradition. But then the age of cinema came along, and then you now have technology and film to communicate those ideas as well. So what I want to do today is kind of look at a couple different examples of how the increase of new technologies and the emergence of new media has allowed people to convey their ideas in ways that they wouldn't have been able to before. And this is, of course, something that you'll want to think about for Project 4, because you're being asked to express yourself, to communicate an idea, whether it be a story or an argument, through a medium that we haven't really used in this class yet. It's all been the written word, essays. Now, the possibilities are open for you to use visuals, to use sound, to use all these different sorts of mediums. So I want to focus on narrative first. We'll talk about argument and about instruction in a minute. But when we think of narrative, I've already listed a few examples: oral tradition, the written word, movies. But there are a lot of other things and methods that we use to tell stories, right? So even something as basic as how you decorate your room or how you decorate your house, that's telling visitors something about who you are. So if you have a bunch of posters up on the wall of bands that you like, it's going to tell people that you're into music. Or if you're somebody that likes sports, maybe there's sports posters up on the wall, things like that. But there's a reason that whenever guests come over, everybody tries to tidy up a little bit. It's not just the fact that they want their guests to feel comfortable, probably that too, but it's also the fact that they're presenting something of themselves to those guests when they come in. And that's telling a story in a way. And there are other sort of spatial means of storytelling aside from just presentation. When you think about war monuments, that's a form of telling a story. You can go to different war memorials. There's usually plaques. There's usually names of people who have died. The memorials themselves are usually on the location of something famous that's happened, whatever that may be. Those are designed in a way to get the people who are visiting to feel an emotion, to feel connection with that place. And that's a form of storytelling as well. You might also think about how other mediums come in handy to tell a story when words fail us. So I don't know if you've ever been in a car wreck or something, but if you've been in a car wreck and you've been in the situation where you have to explain, I don't know, why you were in the right and the other person was in the wrong, it's hard to do because it's hard to visually describe all of the individual elements that go into making up that scene of the accident that you were in. You could try to say, well, I was in the left-hand lane and there was a car behind me and then another car was coming from over here. And already, I mean, as I'm doing this, you can see that I'm relying on visuals, kind of mapping it out with my hands to try to get my point across, because to describe a scene such as a car wreck, you would have to orally describe just about every detail of that map to get your audience to understand where you were at, where the other driver was at, what happened. So usually when people are trying to tell a story like this, they'll take like a napkin or something and actually draw out the road on the napkin and use little sketches or little symbols to illustrate where they were at, where everybody else was at, and then that helps them tell the story better. So where words alone fail, where dialogue fails, visuals can come into play and help the storyteller communicate what they're trying to say. The setting trappings, like the spatial storytelling, that's another way. So what I have for you today to look at is a PowerPoint presentation that I have put together that's going to, again, have a couple different examples of the different means that you have at your disposal to tell a story. And we'll go through that together, and let me get it pulled up here. All right. And hopefully I'll be able to get that up onto the screen without too many problems. But I want to talk first about narratives and then about arguments. We'll get to the arguments in a minute. So with narratives, you want to think about what was possible then and what is possible now. And one thing that has expanded with the expansion of new technology is the storyteller's ability to give the story a scope. So a good example of this, I think kind of the classic example of this, is in William Shakespeare's play Henry V. We've already talked about Shakespeare once this semester, so I thought we'd stick with him for this example too. In Henry V, if you're not familiar with it, it's a play about a great war that takes place between England and France. And at the beginning of the play, an actor steps out onto the stage and addresses the audience directly. He's called the prologue. And he starts asking some rhetorical questions of the audience. One of them is that, can this cockpit, meaning the theater that they're in, hold the vasty fields of France? And of course the answer is, well, they're going to have to imagine that it can, but in reality it can't. And so he starts imploring the audience to use their imagination. He says, suppose within the girdle of these walls are now confined two mighty monarchies. He says, you're going to have to piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. Into 1,000 parts divide one man. Think when we talk of horses that you see them. So it's this long speech about the power of imagination and how they're going to have some imagination to accurately understand what's going on in the story here. Into 1,000 parts divide one man. When they see one actor come out dressed up as a French soldier with a little cardboard sword maybe, they're going to have to imagine that they're seeing not just one person, but a whole army of them. If somebody says, oh, whoa, the horses are coming, everybody watch out, they're going to have to imagine that there's a cavalry charge happening. But with the emergence of cinema, and especially with the emergence of CGI technology, stories can be told in which the imagination is no longer required for that. They can actually be shown to the viewer as it is. So if we think about famous battle scenes in recent movies such as The Lord of the Rings or the Avengers movies, it's all right there in front of you. You don't have to divide one man into 1,000 parts. There are the 1,000 parts right there. So the sense of scope can be increased. The sense of how much depth and how much world building the storyteller can have in their story is increased. George Lucas, the director of the Star Wars movies, he's been kind of ridiculed for re-releasing Star Wars every 10 years or so, with no real differences except that there are a lot more aliens in the background, or maybe there's more troops in the armies. And the reason that he gave for doing this, for these constant re-releases, was this reason. Because in his head, the scope was larger. There were more people there. There were more exotic aliens in the background. So he wanted to take advantage of the new technology that was available to him as the years went by to bring the movie more in line with what his original vision had been. So one interesting thing to note about this new ability to convey a story's scope, and this goes back into what I was talking about last week, where sometimes the transition from one medium to another medium doesn't work very well depending on what story you're trying to tell. If you ever see a film adaptation of Henry V, sometimes the film will begin with an actor sort of awkwardly walking out on stage. He'll read the prologue's lines and then go off to the side, and then it's completely ignored. You don't have to imagine anything because, again, all the armies are there on screen. And it makes one who perhaps hasn't seen the play wonder, oh, what was the point of that speech? Why did he say we were going to have to imagine everything? It was all right there. Because the directors and the filmmakers usually don't want to do away with the prologue speech in general, because it's a well-known speech. It's a good piece of poetry in itself, a good speech that's speaking to the power of imagination and things like that. So they don't want to get rid of it, but they don't quite know what to do with it in the film either, because it's one of those pieces of art that doesn't translate from theater to film very well. In just the same way that sometimes a book doesn't translate into film well, or vice versa. Another thing that new technology has allowed storytellers to do is to make their stories more immersive for their audiences. And again, the cliche is, why would I want to read a book? I'm just staring at pieces of paper with ink on them and hallucinating what I'm reading about for a few hours. Yeah, I've heard that said before about why would you spend so long reading a book, but really that's using your imagination, that's being submersed in the story that's being told. And new technology has always afforded these new opportunities of being really immersive. And so if you look at the picture there in the slideshow, you would see a girl sitting right in front of the radio back in, I don't know, like the 30s or the 40s, listening to the stories that would be told through the radio. And I actually remember my own grandparents, my grandpa, talking about this, how whenever a program would come on that everybody in the family was interested in, they would gather around the radio and sit down and listen to the story being told. And it's kind of weird thinking back on it, because it's just audio. There's no real reason for everybody to have to gather around it. But I guess that was just a way of being more connected to the story, of being able to listen to it more clearly. And then, of course, today you have a sort of immersive storytelling that isn't even available through cinema, and that's video games. And a lot of video games will have the story being told from your own point of view perspective. So if you can see in the two examples here in the slideshow, you're literally in the game. You're not looking at it as an outside observer. You're driving the race cart, or you're setting fire to something over there with your hands. You're acting it out. So again, there's a give and take. It's not just that new media and new technology improve our narrative abilities, they simply broaden them. Now let's turn to other types of writing and see how they developed along these lines as well. I'm going to broadly lump all these types of writing together as purpose-driven works, and they can be argumentative works or works of instruction, how to best say what you want to say. And when thinking about what technology or what media you want to use to convey an argument or instructions, again, it's about thinking what tool works best for the job that you have in mind. It's finding the right medium for the message. And again, this is what I want you to think about for Project 4. So, a while back, I was trying to learn how to play chess. I had some friends who played chess, and I played them every once in a while, and I was awful at it. So it occurred to me, wow, Brookins Library is right here on campus. There's probably some books there that I could learn, maybe some cool strategies so I can just come in and, destroy my friends in the game. That was what I was thinking. So I went to the library and I did find quite a few books on chess. And when I opened them up, eager to find the secrets to being an awesome chess player, I was faced with page after page of what looked like this. And you probably are looking at that going, what in the world's that? Well, that's what I was doing too. Unless you play chess and you can read these sorts of things, in which case you're probably laughing at me right now. But all these chess books were describing moves that were made in the game in this way. You can see that the columns are numbered. So the first move in the game was P to K4, like that. And so there was this whole system developed of shorthand that was written for chess players to be able to write down what happened in a game, who won, who lost, what moves were made. And they used this system, sort of like this shorthand or this other language really, to record what they wanted to say about the game or to explain things about the game. Now this worked if you took the time to sit down and learn what meant what, right? And that did require a lot of time, but there wasn't any really better way of going about doing it because chess is an old game. It's been around longer than even photography has. So when these early chess pros were wanting to either give help to other people through their books or wanting to talk about how they won a specific game, they didn't have the power to just take a picture of the board. They would have to rely on this system. And again, it worked. It wasn't an inadequate tool to convey what they were trying to say, but it wasn't the best tool either. The best tool would be something visual, and that's why if you pick up a modern chess book or if you go online to learn something about chess, you're not going to see these hieroglyphs so much anymore as you're going to see something like this. You're going to see the board, you're going to see the pieces being moved with an arrow, and this can be reproduced over and over again because that's just an image that the printer can take and copy and paste over and over and then just change the pieces that they want to have changed. It's a computer-generated image. Before that technology existed, no one would want to sit down and draw out the board over and over again because that would take forever. It'd even take longer then than it would if they were using that crazy system of all the different letters. So that's one example of how the new technology allowed something that somebody was trying to say to finally convey that in the most clear way that there was. And now I want to talk about these things not just in terms of technology, but in terms of the media themselves. When you're thinking about what medium you want to use for your project, you don't want to just think about what's possible or what's most suitable. There are some specific things that you should keep in mind. One is that what medium you choose determines what audience you're going to be most appealing to. So you can use a specific medium to cater to a targeted audience. And just as an example of this, I want you to take a minute. You can see right here in the slide is the alphabet. I want you to take a minute and read that silently in your head. Not out loud, but in your head. Now, you may have noticed that as you were going along through it, I don't know, I do this. And in the past, I've asked people in the class if they do this, and I usually get the majority of them raise their hands. Did you sing it or did you say it when you were going through this in your head? Most people say that they sang it. Now, if you didn't sing it, then that's fine too. You think differently than the rest of us, which is great. But For me anyway, I always sing the alphabet, even if it's in my head, if I'm not saying it out loud, because that's how it was drilled into me when I was a kid, right? When everybody was in elementary school and kindergarten, the alphabet was a song. And it wasn't just the alphabet. There are different songs about numbers too. I remember a song that I learned about counting to tens. I'm not going to try to sing it for you now or reproduce it, but there are a whole bunch of different things like that. And that's because it's easier to remember the lyrics of a song than it is to remember a dry prose text or just dry information. And that's why when somebody's trying to convey something to children, they tend to use songs to get their points across. Because the song, everybody knows. They stick in your head. They're easy to remember. Another good example of this is using storytelling to communicate abstract ideas to a targeted audience that maybe couldn't understand this if you were just reading off the plain facts to them. So, for example, if you take the movie The Lion King, you got the famous scene where the main character Simba's dad dies. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen The Lion King, I'm sorry, but that happens. It makes you wonder, why is this happening in a kid's movie? What are the kids expected to get out of this? So to convey the idea of death to children is a tricky thing because you could tell them just what death is and they're not going to have a grasp of it. And here I've given the textbook definition of death. Actually, it's the Wikipedia definition of death. To illustrate what that sounds like to somebody who isn't attempting to use storytelling or any other means of communication except for the textbook definition. We get, death is the permanent cessation of all biological functions that sustain a living organism. Phenomena which commonly bring about death include aging, predation, malnutrition, disease. And it goes on to say death, particularly the death of humans, has commonly been considered a sad or unpleasant occasion. You gotta love the ending of that definition there. A sad or unpleasant occasion. To put it mildly, yeah. So if you take that definition of what death is and tell it to a bunch of 9-year-olds or 10-year-olds, they're gonna go, huh? It's not really gonna have an impact on them. But through storytelling, you can convey the idea of what death is. They're watching The Lion King. They're seeing that his dad isn't moving, that he's sad that his dad isn't moving, that he's not there anymore. You're conveying the idea of this abstract thing to them in a way that's more effective than just the textbook definition way would have been. So, things to consider for when you're going about either telling a narrative or putting together a purpose-driven work using other mediums than writing. One, what is your purpose? What are you trying to convey? If you're trying to make an argument about some style of music or about the importance of music, it would probably make sense to use something that relies on audio. If you're trying to describe a complicated scene, you're probably going to want to use visuals. What appeals, strategies are you going to be using to get your point across, and what medium most benefits those appeals? Again, a picture is worth 1,000 words is an expression for a reason. You can have the commercials about the abused animals that are in cages and that really need your help, and they'll be fine if you just donate 10 cents a month or whatever. You could have that as a voiceover. You could have just words on the screen. Maybe that'd work for some people, but they always make a point of putting in footage of the trembling dogs and the dirty looking cats in the cages, things like that, to create a pathos appeal for people to donate to them. That's not to say that they're doing something nefarious either. I don't want to make it seem like that. It is a good cause to want to help abused animals or animals without a home. But that is the method that they're using to persuade you to do so. You'll also want to consider what your tone is. And tone is an interesting one for Project 4 because when we think about what we've been doing for the last couple projects in this class, they've all been academic in nature. You've been writing academic essays, and they're in the context of a class that you're turning into me. But now you're trying to communicate something that isn't an essay. So your tone can be sort of less formal and more adapted to the medium that you choose. So for example, if you're going to do a podcast, you don't want to just be reading off of a piece of paper or reading off of your essay or whatever it is that you're doing. You'll want to have that conversational tone, maybe have a few jokes in there, something that would be suited to a podcast. And then finally, who is your audience? And that ties in with the question of tone. If you were going to write a story or make an argument that was geared toward children, you would want to use something that children would pay attention to. Or if you were the opposite, if you were going to try to make an argument that was serious and perhaps there was a danger if people didn't listen to what the argument you were trying to make, something would go wrong. It was very formal. You wouldn't want to turn in something written in crayon, right? It would want to have that look of formality to it, that look that says that you mean business. So I hope that those are some good examples of how finding the right medium for your message isn't just a matter of, I like drawing, I'm going to do a drawing, or I like podcasts, I'm going to do a podcast. There is an art to picking the specific one depending on what it is that you're trying to get across to your audience. And that's not to say that if you pick one that's kind of appropriate but not the best choice, everything's going to fall apart. That's not true either. If you look at back to the example of the chessboard, sure, that system of numbering and hieroglyphs worked before the technology existed to do it in a better way. But once that technology came out, the writers of whatever books those were able to more effectively communicate what they were trying to say. Okay, so I hope that gives you something to think about. I hope everybody started working or at least thinking about Project 4. Again, if you have any questions on that, please don't hesitate to email me and let me know. I'm going to be posting to Blackboard soon some how-to videos that I found on YouTube. I'm just looking for good ones at this point, ones that will be informative or instructive about how to use the different sort of technologies that you might need to use to do this project, like Windows Movie Maker or GarageBand, things like that. Okay, so that's all I've got for today. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next week.